Eurosceptic forces are gaining power across 24 EU countries, with 84 MEPs. The far-right Patriots group now makes the third largest party in the EU Parliament. This is a surprising bold win that is currently reshaping EU politics. Is Europe heading for another Brexit moment? And which country is the first in line to go? Across Europe, discontent is taking on a new shape. Denmark has voted to opt out of 4 EU policies so far, while in France, nearly 1 in 3 voters want out entirely. So what does this mean for Europe's future, and which country might trigger the next exit shock? Well, let's break it down. It's 2025, and something feels strangely familiar. Across Europe, you can almost hear a low hum of dissatisfaction pulsing beneath the surface. Voters in Poland, Italy, France, and even the Netherlands are now openly embracing the same sentiments that the UK once entertained in the years leading up to its historic 2016 vote to leave the EU. In the 2024 European Parliament elections, right-wing and nationalist parties such as the Conservatives and the Reformist group and the Identity and Democratic Party made significant gains. Germany's Alternative für Deutschland, France's Rassemblement National, and Austria's Freedom Party all rose high in popularity, while in Italy, Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy tightened its grip. Moreover, these parties don't just share a conservative worldview, they also seem to question the value of being part of the EU itself. And this isn't just about fringe movements anymore. As of April 2025, Eurosceptic and nationalist parties are part of the ruling coalition in at least 7 EU countries. These are no longer minor protests, as they now hold real power and shape real policies. One good reason for this shift is fatigue. The economic recovery from COVID hasn't been as swift as promised, as many EU economies bounced back unevenly. Southern nations such as Spain and Greece were struggling with record youth unemployment, while countries on the eastern side, such as Romania and Bulgaria, continued to face massive outflows of young talent seeking better opportunities in the West. And then came the energy crisis, which is made worse by the war in Ukraine and Europe's messy shift away from Russian gas. The public's patience is indeed fraying. The EU headquarters, which was once seen as the stable engineering of progress, is now being criticized for being too slow and somewhat disconnected. A recent Eurobarometer survey in May 2025 revealed that trust in the EU is still very high at 52%, the highest since 2007. However, in France, about 34% of French people say they trusted the EU, while 55% said they no longer had confidence in Brussels. In Italy, that number dropped below 30%. And then there's also the question of sovereignty. As the EU tries to enforce more unified rules on migration, energy policy, and digital regulation, some member states feel like they're being micromanaged from afar. For example, Hungary and Poland have been engaged in ongoing legal disputes with EU institutions over concerns regarding their rule of law and judicial independence. Leaders like Viktor Orban and Mateusz Morawiecki have in the past framed Brussels as overreaching and branding the EU not as a union, but as a threat to their national identity. This makes you wonder, is it just anger, or is there real appetite for another exit? In 2018, Italy showed the strongest will to have a Brexit-style exit from the EU. While not all of them would vote to leave, the fact that a good percentage would want to be asked the question is enough to sound alarm bells. The EU isn't collapsing, well, not yet. However, the mood is changing rapidly, and what was once a bold project of unity is now feeling like a rigid structure many want to shake free from. And in all of these, what did the EU learn the first time with Brexit? When the UK voted to leave the European Union in June 2016 and ultimately did so in January 2020, it wasn't just a political earthquake, it was, in fact, a stress test for the entire EU. At first, the EU's response was defensive as key EU leaders scrambled to show unity. But behind closed doors, there was much panic. For the first time, the ever-closer union had taken a hit that couldn't be explained away. The way Brexit turned out offered painful lessons in negotiation, diplomacy, and miscalculation. The UK believed that its economic leverage would force the EU into agreeing to a flexible deal, but that never happened. Instead, Brussels stayed firm, prioritizing the union of its remaining 27 members over the ease of British trade. The Northern Ireland Protocol also became a nightmare as British fishing rights, trade rules, and immigration systems all fell into years of administrative uncertainty. And yet, despite the chaos and economic pain, Brexit hasn't scared off other potential leavers. In fact, in some countries, as we will see, it has inspired them. In France, Marine Le Pen has attempted to cite Brexit as proof that leaving is possible, even if it is difficult. In Italy, parties like Lega and Fratelli d'Italia argue that if the UK can regain control over its laws and borders, so can they. Brexit didn't just close a door, in fact, for some, it cracked it open even more. There's another side to this story, though, where the economic aftermath of Brexit did offer a warning. Between 2016 and 2022, the UK lost an estimated £100 billion in output due to its reduced trade flows and investment uncertainty with the rest of the EU. British exporters faced red tape at EU borders, while London's financial sector slowly lost ground to rivals in Paris and Frankfurt. These facts have not been forgotten, but they haven't been enough to stop the growing discontent. This suggests a deeper reality. Many citizens now view economic hardship as the price for political freedom. Brexit also changed how the EU views referendums. Since 2016, the EU has been more cautious about allowing any treaty reform or major policy shift to be put to a national vote. The fear? Well, let's just say that one referendum could trigger many more unravelings. This has, in turn, created even more tension because while leaders try to prevent future exits, their reluctance to consult the public extensively only fuels anti-EU sentiment. So, in trying to keep the house from falling apart, some doors have been sealed shut, but those inside, well, they're beginning to knock. And in some countries, they're not just knocking, they're already halfway out. Step into the political scene of Europe and you'll notice the lingering sentiments of nations on the edge. In Hungary, former Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has been locked in a high-stakes fight with Brussels since 2020. His government was known to repeatedly push back against EU criticism over alleged abuses of democratic norms and media freedom. In 2024, Brussels triggered Article 7 proceedings, which was the nuclear option that allows the EU to sanction any member state due to concerns about judicial independence and media laws. Shortly after, many Hungarians began to complain about EU leaders treating Hungary like a homework assignment gone wrong. Almost 1 in 2 citizens believe they deserved a direct say in the matter, so this is no longer just some metaphorical crack, it's a real hollow. Poland shows a slightly different story. The Law and Justice Party, which fell from power in late 2023 but continues to hold some level of influence, has continued to rally opposition around what it calls EU overreach. Warsaw's conflicts with EU courts over judicial reform and climate policy have cost the country billions in suspended cohesion funds. In March, a Polish exit movement named Polexit garnered enough support to collect over 100,000 signatures within 3 weeks. Young Poles, often the most pro-EU, are becoming skeptical when they see the government's coffers being shaken. This mood shift won't necessarily collapse the Union, but it shows the centre of Europe might not be as firm as we thought. Italy offers yet another perspective. In March 2025, the Brothers of Italy party firmly secured close to 30% in an intentional poll. The same survey showed that 34% of Italians believed current EU economic rules and immigration requirements are not helping their country's growth. Italy still receives billions in EU recovery funds, and most Italians understand the cost of leaving financially. However, the anger beneath the surface is real. Frustration over Italian fishermen being unable to access the Mediterranean waters freely, anger at the slow EU bureaucracy that delays reconstruction funds, and resentment over being part of the Eurozone while struggling with inflation. Italy's inflation rate stood close to 2% in early 2025, which was significantly lower than the Eurozone average of 2.3%. Then there's France, where whispers of Frexit are no longer confined to fringe corners. Even though President Emmanuel Macron maintains a pro-European stance, his popularity is beginning to wane since the Gaza conflict began. The Rassemblement National polled a historic 30% in the European elections. Many cite frustration around EU agricultural policy as farmers say they feel ignored when Brussels negotiates its subsidies, while citizens complain about rising food prices amid complex regulations that seem to do more harm than good. In the Netherlands, a party forum for democracy and radical rights voices within Geert Wilders' PW was stepping onto the stage with growing energy. The Netherlands, which has long been one of the Eurozone's strongest net contributors, is beginning to feel frustrated with financing other weakened economies amid the larger intervention sent to southern Europe during the COVID recovery phase. Although the country benefits from free movement and trade, its citizens argue that solidarity is becoming increasingly one-sided. Pull together these snapshots and you get a clear pattern. In many EU countries, it's no longer fringe voices that are shouting from the rooftops. It's fast becoming a mainstream debate. And as that discussion shifts from mere metaphor to referendum, those quiet cracks begin to feel like fault lines ready to fracture. So who will act first? When we consider the economic and legal barriers, Hungary and Poland are unlikely to bolt immediately. Italy could test the waters in a non-binding referendum before taking any real steps. France and the Netherlands have a stronger public appetite, but their economies remain deeply tied to the single market. With that in mind, it's time to look at what's really fueling this unrest, because unless these core issues are addressed, the pressure won't disappear. With anti-EU voices beginning to speak, they often reflect deep-seated underlying concerns. They often echo the economic, cultural, and institutional imbalances planting into the Union itself. Take a look at the widening economic divide between Northern and Southern Europe. Countries in the Eurozone's north boast GDP per capita that is consistently above the Euro area average. Their industrial output also remains strong and unemployment rates stay low, often under 5%. In contrast, southern nations such as Greece, Portugal, and Spain still struggle to a great extent. Even a decade after the heat of the Greek debt crisis, their economies remain significantly reliant on tourism and vulnerable to external shocks. These economic gaps continually create tensions. Northern taxpayers allegedly contribute more to the EU's coffers, while southern countries rely on subsidies to stay afloat. That imbalance is taking away solidarity, as citizens in the north often wonder why their money keeps flowing south. People in the south are equally asking why growth is still lagging when the euro has already promised stability. That gap represents not only a policy challenging, but also a growing sense of unfairness to some members. Now, consider migration. Countries like Italy and Greece, which are sitting on the EU's external border, have felt the brunt of refugees flow from Africa and the Middle East for a long time now. The EU response? Relocation quotas and border funds often fail to reflect the rising costs of housing, healthcare, and security. However, countries that are further inland feel less burdened by this activity. That disparity fuels resentment with questions like, why should some nations bear the stress while others enjoy the benefits? Here comes the cultural resistance to most of the liberal policies. Eastern members like Poland and Hungary have repeatedly clashed with Brussels over its judicial reforms and LGBTQ rights. In addition, social conservatives in these nations see EU policies as an attack on traditional values. When EU courts demand legal standards or non-discrimination rules, local leaders frame the issue as Brussels colonizing their culture. That rhetoric echoes far beyond parliaments, reshaping the public view that the EU has grown too powerful. Then there are institutional frustrations within the EU itself. The European Commission, which proposes laws, run day-to-day operations, and enforce compliance with the EU, has sometimes felt distant. The Eurozone also lacks a singular finance minister who would be able to coordinate its 20-plus national policies. Instead, it relies on the European Stability Mechanism with no real executive final say. In any internal crisis, response is often slow and more political than pragmatic. A good example, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in early 2022, the EU mobilized fast on economic sanctions against Russia. But it took nearly a full year to agree on a joint energy strategy that could reduce reliance on Russian gas. Meanwhile, pipelines were halted even as industries across Central and Eastern Europe were under threat of winter shutdown. The delays, which were owing to competing interests, forced national governments to act unilaterally rather than as a bloc. As a result of this move, citizens began to feel that the EU doesn't move fast enough, but those unilateral actions can further deepen divisions with the EU. So what does all this add up to? Structural stresses that no single election, summit, or rescue package can fix. With those deep-seated challenges identified, the next question becomes urgent. What is still keeping this group of 27 individual countries together? Or, in reverse, what could finally cause it to crack wide open? Let's take a look. Europe's unity can often feel invisible, but its strength is built on everyday things that touch people's lives. First, think about its monetary policies. The EU sends billions each year to struggling regions. In 2021, Poland received around €76.5 billion from 2021 to 2027 through its cohesion policy, which was used in funding roads, schools, and farms. These funds helped many communities feel seen and supported. The single market is another glue that seems to be binding member states together. Since its launch, nearly 450 million people can trade freely across all 27 countries with no tariffs or custom delays. This makes goods cheaper and also makes jobs more secure. It also helps ease the energy shock after the 2022 war began in Ukraine, as Europe still moved gas and electricity where they were needed the most. Climate targets have become shared goals. The EU became committed to cutting emissions by at least 55% by 2030, compared to the level it was in the 1990s. Every member is signed onto this, from Luxembourg's solar farms to Romania's wind parks, so this joint mission gives more Europeans a sense of common purpose. Security also binds the bloc. When some Nordic countries speak, they know they're protected under EU defence agreements and remain largely out of view. That cooperation led to EU defence spending surpassing €200 billion for the first time in 2022, thereby helping to boost its joint NATO missions and intelligence-sharing efforts. But cracks are growing. The recovery from the pandemic was uneven among member states, as Germany was quick to bounce back, while countries like Greece took longer to do the same. Talks over a shared €750 billion recovery fund sparked tension as some argued that richer countries were being forced to foot the bill for others. Energy disagreements also caused friction at some point. After Russia shut off its gas supplies in mid-2022, Hungary refused to back a blanket ban. They argued that their industries and home heating systems depended on it. 3 years on, disagreements over when to end Russian pipelines remained unresolved, as citizens in Budapest still wondered why the EU can't help heat their homes and why so many rules need solid unanimity to become effective. So will these funding cuts, recovery gaps, and energy arguments hurt the EU's unity, or will its shared benefits still outweigh what divides them? Next, let's look at a future where unity doesn't hold and what might follow. Imagine waking up to the news that 2 or 5 more countries plan to leave the EU, closing the border on day one, and debating how to untangle 20 years of shared law. Where would Europe stand? What would change overnight? And what harder effects would unfold over the coming year? Well, first would be the wind of legal chaos. EU laws applies to every member that borders another. If Hungary were to quit, its borders would now require custom checks again. Its farm rules would need rewriting, and its courts would have to interpret laws differently again, notwithstanding the businesses that would face disruptions too. This would unavoidably lead to significant economic damages. Shared investments could falter, and if Italy were to exit, the bloc would lose its third-largest economy by GDP. Everyone trading euro-denominated bonds across the zone would worry about stability, as currency markets would shake, especially if the exit triggered fears that other countries, say Poland or the Netherlands, might act next. But loss of unity isn't only about law and money, its shared defence would suffer too. EU contributions to peacekeeping missions across other continents rely on trust, so without countries like Hungary, would NATO military routes through Eastern Europe still be reliable? Then there's the social consequences. A sense of shared citizenship among Europeans could fade. Erasmus student exchanges might drop. Young people in border regions might ask, why can't I easily visit my friends across the country anymore? And just like that, such goodwill might be hard to rebuild. Still, not every exit ends in immediate collapse, as we saw with Brexit. Tomorrow's Europe could look very different. Institutions could evolve, borders might shift, and identity may be redrawn. So what's clear is that the question is no longer whether, but how prepared the EU might be when the next exit knock comes. No country may leave tomorrow, but if enough stop playing by the same rules, does it matter if the door ever actually opens again? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.